Hello and welcome to Exploring Global Problems, a podcast where we talk to academics from Swansea University whose groundbreaking research is tackling global challenges, from health innovation to sustainable futures and the environment, from digital technologies to clean energy. My name is Sam Blaxland, and today I'm joined by Dr Gabriela Jiga-Boy, Senior Lecturer in Psychology here at Swansea. Gabriela's research explores who we trust and why. She focuses in particular on the trust people have in politicians and scientific experts. Gabriela, welcome to Exploring Global Problems.
Hi, Sam. Thank you for having me.
It's good to see you. Really interesting topic. Let's dive straight into it. Why is it important that we trust political leaders and scientific experts? I know there's two elements to that, so however you want to approach it.
Well, you might remember that back in 2016, there's been a seemingly inconsequential event happening in the UK, seen around June time. And that event seemed to have produced a dent in the social cohesion in the UK. And at that time, we could hear quite often leaders saying a lot of things. But one of the sentences we've heard over and over again was that the public has had enough of experts.
So this is the European Union referendum, obviously, and
yes,
and
exactly.
This is
you guessed right.
particularly Michael Gove saying in a Sky News, I think, interview, wasn't it, that
it was.
The public have had enough of
experts. Probably he was likely referring to various experts in finance and banking, trying to warn about the dire effects of Brexit.
From organisations with acronyms, I think, is something he was going to say.
Yeah.
Sort of all these supposed, out there.
And it kind of sparked an interest in myself and my colleagues. I'm going to refer a lot to this work as our team's work, because it is a team's work. It's always been. But we were wondering, is that really the case? Is that really that British public don't trust experts or don't want to hear from experts ever again? And we started looking at polls done before that time, and it didn't look like the trust was a problem, especially around the scientific expertise, scientific community, compared to actually trust in politicians, who was much lower. But nowadays we hear trust everywhere. Everywhere in the political discourse, people talk about trust and distrust. We also talk about a word called polarization, and trust is a form of affective polarization. And when you look at research, it looks to that trust matters a lot. When people trust their political leaders, they tend to comply with what those leaders suggest. So during COVID, there was better compliance with mask mandates, social distancing, all those measures when people, trusted those in power. When that trust is broken, we see a lot of behavior that doesn't reflect people care about their community or care about doing things for the best. So trust seems to be like something very important. In a very recent assembly and report from UCL, actually, Citizen Assembly from the Constitution Unit, UCL, we saw that trust is one of the key elements that people think the political discourse in the UK needs the most right now. So that's reassuring, because we talk about people from all walks of life, not just the elite, not just scientists. So we've been looking at this issue since 2016 with optimistic and not very optimistic results so far.
And is it fair to say that trust in politicians is lower than trust in scientific experts?
So one of the things that was quite surprising for us, so we use experimental methods to try to understand these things, which means that we expose participants to different scenarios, and we see whether the responses are different across those different scenarios. And what happens is that COVID presented a novel opportunity to study this, because all of a sudden we had a shared threat. You wouldn't expect much polarization about something that threatens everybody everywhere. And we had a research protocol called the party over policy effect, that research being done by some of our colleagues in the US before COVID, whereby they find that when you offer a policy to participants, a policy that seemingly comes from politicians they vote for or politicians they don't vote for, they tend to support it more if it's coming from politicians they vote for. So they put the party over the content of the policy, hence the name. So during COVID, we did exactly the same. We used the same protocol to study this issue. And again, the results were quite clear. People put the pandemic over the policy, so they tended to support it more if those measures about COVID mitigation came from politicians they would vote for, compared to if they came from the opposition.
Interesting. Although, of course, I guess in the early days of COVID, the political parties were were aligned, weren't they? And they were saying these same things. Were there implications for that down the line when you had, for example, the Welsh government saying something different to the UK government? Obviously, they're different political parties.
So what we notice is not just our data, it's lots of other sets of data across the UK, other countries, is that as long as the message is clear and cohesive, people tend to listen to it and comply. As soon as you have divergent messages, either between devolved nations and central government in the UK or between different states in the US, here problems appear because which political leaders will people follow most likely? So yes, indeed, we did see at the very beginning, though, in some countries, the pandemic became polarized very early on. It shouldn't have been, but it did. It happened.
Well, I felt like at the very beginning of the COVID era, there was a lot of broad acceptance of the messaging coming from all the different political parties, wasn't there? But that didn't last for very long, and there did start to be there was cracks, wasn't there, in the messaging from the politicians. But then also, I feel like a little bit later there was an element of distrust about the scientific messages as well, that we were being told, for example, to always wash our hands, whereas actually the virus was airborne and hand washing really didn't do very much. So were you able to trace when that trust was to some extent breaking down?
Some people have. So colleagues in Germany have traced trust in scientists during the pandemic. And they noticed it was extremely high at the beginning. It started to wean off as the pandemic unfolded because obviously recommendations changed because the facts change. So this is a very important issue you're raising. In fact, what happens to trust in science and expertise when facts change? As the scientific community, we see that as completely normal. When facts change, I change my mind, we say, right? So we're quite able to keep an open mind. It would be foolish not to. However, the public doesn't always understand or doesn't always interpret these changes as positive. They might not be able to cope with U-turns in policymaking, not because they couldn't, but communication about these U-turns is not always the best. So I think there's quite a lot to do from the policymaking side to make clear that these U-turns are necessary, they're evidence-based, and they're normal. Knowing that a virus is not surface-based but airborne. So what we notice in our data is that although people put the party over the policy when it comes to politicians, the messages that received the best support across the political spectrum were those put forward by scientists and experts. And we didn't really expect to see that because we do see quite a lot of divergent opinions between conservatives and liberal about their trust in science. However, across the political spectrum, in 7 countries we've surveyed at the time, expert proposed policies fare the best. And that sends a nice message to those to say the people have had enough of experts. Maybe people have had enough of expert messages becoming politicized.
I see. And I guess in this country, figures like the chief medical officer standing up, they're not political, they're not politicians, they didn't ask to be in the limelight. Is there an element of that people trust them more because they seem more, I don't know, virtuous perhaps?
Well, civil servants are independent of government, right? So at least technically speaking. So we should see trust in them as relatively stable. However, you do associate them with politicians because they speak next to them. Just as you had somebody like Dr. Anthony Fauci in the US speaking next to then President Donald Trump. So these kind of associations might not be very benign. Sometimes something we know in psychology is called the halo effect. The fact that you tend to attribute something that is completely irrelevant to a person or an object just because they've been associated with the one before. So a genuine question we haven't yet researched is, how does trust in science and expertise, how is it hurt when politicians do things they shouldn't do or deny scientific claims? Does that impact how much trust we have in scientists who are not to blame in that?
And I suppose one of the takeaway messages of COVID is that there was no clear line about where the politics stopped and the science started.
Yeah, so that's something, a very nice quote I like to bring up quite often by a former CDC president, Richard Bessner, saying, if you have a politician on the stage, chances are that half of the nation will do exactly the opposite of what they say. And that is because when politicians communicate about public health issues or issues that concern everybody, they don't just communicate about the content. They bring up a lot of identities along with them, ideological identities. They bring up their own education. And all these things signal they are part of a group. Now, if myself as the voter don't feel like I'm part of that group,
sure,
I might just dismiss their messages just because I don't feel I am like them. I don't feel they are my in-group. I feel there's somebody different.
I sense, and maybe I'm just plugged into the wrong networks, that this polarization that you're describing is getting worse.
Yes and no. We hear a lot of keywords these days, right? We hear culture wars, divisiveness, segregation on opinions. And let's make it clear. I mean, the big elephant in the room is there is polarization in this world. There are clear topics that should not be polarized because scientifically speaking, there's consensus, such as climate change, such as the safety of vaccines, for example. However, they are polarized. My question is, who stands to gain from polarizing them? And on the one hand, this polarization is not something we have by default, but it is partly due to the stances that a lot of political elite or media elite have on these issues. And let's face it, very often we see polarized things because it arranges a lot of people to say that the public swings this way or that way. Let's talk, for example, immigration. So what we notice in a poll from Future Britain in 2022 is that the British attitudes towards immigration have improved for the past 7 years. So if you ask individual respondents, how do you feel about immigration in the UK? Their responses are quite positive. But if you ask them a very different question, how do you feel other British people's attitudes to immigration? Do you feel they have improved or they have gotten worse? The overwhelming response is they have gotten worse.
Yeah.
So you see a difference between my perception of my own attitude and the perception of the norm. And we call that a misperceived social norm. And in psychology, we have a term for it. It's called pluralistic ignorance. Is the fact that on the one hand, I could be comfortable with certain things, but I don't think anybody else is.
Sure.
So going back to our work on trust, what we noticed in a quite large data set is that this party over policy effect occurred. That was a fact. But we noticed that everybody thought other respondents are even more sensitive to the party over policy effect than they were. So if, for example, let's say you're a Democrat voter in the US, I give you a policy about COVID-19 sponsored by Republican politicians, okay? And I'm asking you on a scale from 1 to 7, how much would you support these measures? Imagine the measures are legit. They're good for the community and so on. They're not based on senseless things. So on a scale from 1 to 7, the policy comes from Republicans. I'm asking you, you might say, well, I don't like Republicans maybe because I'm a Democrat voter, but I'll give it a 5. It's quite a good one. Then now, if I ask you, how much do you think other Democrat voters like you would support this policy put forward by Republicans? The chances are, quite high chances, you will say, I don't think we'll like it. It'll be a 3.5. So you might go with the content when the content is right, but you don't expect other people would. And what happens is that misperceived social norm is very likely to guide your own behavior more than the norm you yourself believe in.
Yeah.
And that is why we see part of this polarization that you say it's getting worse. We believe that our data shows that it's actually part of it is a false polarization. It's the fact that people do think everybody else is more polarized than they are themselves.
I can very much believe that. And I take on board everything you've said. I'm just thinking in the case of COVID as well, I still feel that consensus about what should have been done about it at the very beginning broke down quite significantly to the point where, whilst a lot of people probably still do trust, particularly the scientific experts, there is an undercurrent of feeling that a lot of decisions were wrong, that perhaps the threat of the virus was overstated, or perhaps the reaction to it was overblown. And it might not be a majority or a mainstream opinion, but there is a significant opinion out there that is a lot more skeptical about the sort of gold standard nature of scientific advice.
Absolutely. So we've seen a lot of misinformation and disinformation campaigns during COVID that proved to be quite efficient in making people vaccine hesitant, or at least in doubting the. And on the one hand, of course, I'm not defending fake news and disinformation about vaccines, but you have to look at the reasons people believe these things. There are a lot of legitimate concerns. For many people, the fact that we had vaccines so quickly, seemingly quickly,
Sure.
Was surprising and frightening. The majority of the population might not have known that the RNA technology that went into making those vaccines took 25 years to develop. Okay, it wasn't something done on the spot. So quite a lot of the concerns behind hesitancy may be legitimate. Now, how leaders respond to that is a very different thing. So there are lots of initiatives to curb misinformation, disinformation in place. Social media can do a lot of stuff. What we've noticed is that what kind of media people consume, and especially during COVID, makes a lot of difference. So certainly more conservative media was linked to more false claims about vaccines, distrust in science, and so on. So people who consume that, especially more conservative participants, tend to be more vaccine hesitant and distrust science more. But if they consume a more ideologically diverse media diet, that could have a very good effect. So it can help people become a little bit more skeptical about all this misinformation, all these false claims, and it increases their chances to get the vaccine.
Yeah, and it's interesting because skepticism as an idea is actually what underpins the scientific method, isn't it? In some ways, we say we are skeptical about this, like you say, the facts change, we change our mind. But is one of the issues related to trust here that there were incorrect calls made throughout the process by both scientists, but particularly the political interpretation of the science, and people see that, and that is what underpins a lot of the mistrust.
What we've seen in the UK quite a lot during the pandemic was, and we've discovered a lot of it now with the COVID inquiry, is that a lot of scientific advice was not taken on board by different governments. And sooner or later, the public will understand this kind of lack of cohesion and lack of consistency. And when there is lack of consistency, people are left to do whatever they think best. The majority of us are not equipped, scientifically speaking, to know which mask is the best, which sanitizer has the right proportion of alcohol to help us clean our hands, and so on. So we can't deny that not all policymaking is evidence-based.
Sure.
And I was just looking into these scenarios where ideally all policymaking was evidence-based. What happens with people's trust? In psychology, we also have something. So when you say you want people to trust science and experts, we don't mean blind trust. We mean something we call a healthy trust, or even a healthy skepticism. You should be able to ask questions, and you should be able to try to get the right information about something that you doubt. And science is based on that. And we should encourage this kind of attitude. It should especially not be about believing everything. In a healthy democracy especially, that's quite dangerous.
And I've got a question on that in a second, but just one more thing on this, on the whole idea about, I guess, trust in the scientific method. I mean, in the past, scientific consensus on various things has been wrong, hasn't it? It often not, but I'm thinking, I mean, this is my sort of historian coming out here, but the thalidomide scandal a very long time ago, but also the way that people used to operate on the brain, very clear scientific consensus on things that have now been disproved. Is again there evidence that people think this way and think, well, consensuses have been very wrong in the past, they might be wrong again?
Absolutely. Well, when you look at some of the conspiracy theories around COVID, this is one of the biggest foundation. The fact that some people who've started disseminating this had extremely terrible experience with healthcare systems, with disease, with the way family members have gone through particular illnesses. So their distrust in the medical community is, in a sense, understandable to some extent. Now, how do you go from a very bad personal situation to distrusting a whole community or a whole process? That's a big jump. What I think happens is that more than trusting science or scientists themselves, what's the most sustainable thing for a society is trusting the scientific process. How did we get to that conclusion? Because actually you see that, you don't see it only in science, you see it in the media. If you look at someone like Mariana Spring on BBC demonstrating how investigative journalism is done, it's a scientific process. You go from step to check, to verify your sources, to find corroborating evidence, and so on. It's scientific. This is what we do in scientific experiments.
I guess the counter-argument to that from some people would be is that humans, even very good scientists, humans are fallible. They also can be political, small p political themselves, but also funding and money. Sometimes you need to get very big research grants and you might, overemphasize something because you want money. That might be the counter-argument.
I take it on board. So what typically happens with publishing results, you do have to declare your conflict of interest. So if, let's say, you have a paper on the quality of water that is sponsored by a water company, that might not exactly be the best trustworthy source you may have found. So absolutely, that is really important. What kind of message we shape based on results is a different thing. So we know that some conspiracy theories about COVID, for example, started because some very inflammatory headlines about things written in the press. And scientists themselves sometimes are tempted to put up headlines or press releases about their own data that sounds far more exotic and far more impactful than what the actual data shows. So all of us, we have to be careful about how we market these ideas, because I think the closer we stay to what the data shows without sensationalism, the better it would be for everybody, for scientists and for the community who hears from us.
There was a story in my newspaper yesterday at the time of recording, which was actually about Michael Gove making a speech saying that if politics in certain areas of public life continues to be done badly, young people in particular will lose trust in their politicians, and that's actually bad for democracy in the long run. So I wanted to ask, is there a danger that if trust really does weaken in certain circumstances, that can lead to very bad outcomes?
Well, I'm not exactly sure he's the perfect person to give people lessons about trust.
He was there talking about it. I mean, I guess I'm asking is what happens if trust does weaken fundamentally?
Two things. First of all, if you stop distrusting those governing, it means you are no longer willing to make yourself vulnerable to them leading, right? Because that's what trust actually means, that you make yourself vulnerable because you expect something positive in return. Very often in political literature, we see that if trust is lacking, people may try to abstain from being responsible citizens, like voting, or might try to find leaders who they can trust. And nowadays we see a lot of populism happening, including what we call science-related populism, the fact that it feels good to think of scientists as this elite that has nothing to do with your ordinary life, and you at the same time, you're entitled to your opinion, which should weigh as much as a scientific fact, So this is one of the big consequences of lack of trust. Another one is how much politicians actually trust their citizens could comply with their measures is equally important, because you think of yourself as, as a child. If you don't feel trusted by your parents, you might not want to try to do things that are good for you, or you might not to be very transparent with them. So people might perceive the whole society as anomic and just cease to participate in things that are necessary for communities to stand up.
Yeah, I'm just thinking it might not always be a very popular message, would it, from scientific experts and political leaders saying to the general population, no, we do know more than you, and you just need to trust us. That's perhaps not always in the spirit of the times, but you're saying that is essentially what does need to be done sometimes.
A scientific opinion anchored in facts is qualitatively better than an opinion anchored in an anecdotal fact. Okay. Now, all of us may have examples in our lives that are very vivid. And if they make us judge the world based on that very tiny sample, well, it might give us meaning, but it might not be representative for what's really going on. So I'm not telling people, my scientific opinion is much better. I'm saying that just because everybody can have an opinion doesn't mean that opinion reflect what's really going on. Like in journalism, probably you know better than I do. If somebody tells you it's raining and another person tells you it's not, well, your job is to go in the window and see what's actually going on, to fact check it, right? So I think us scientists have a big duty of reaching out and talking about what we do in a way that is accessible for everybody without patronizing. I don't feel it's very conducive to anything good to tell people, I'm a scientist, I know much better than anybody else. But I do think it's conducive to a good democracy to base policymaking on evidence and to communicate that as clearly as possible. I think it's in the communication. The key is in the communication from scientists, from policymakers, from everybody. And just yesterday, I spoke to a lady who told me a lot of things about reflecting conspiracy theories and so on. But the conversation went on really well. We were both listening to one another. We were receptive to the reasons why we were thinking like that. And it ended up being quite a nice encounter, I think there's a way out of
there's always a place for discussion and dialogue, for sure. I mean, you've raised a really important point there, I think, which is that there is so much information swirling around, isn't there, or what seems to be information at least, and so many different outlets where people can get news or opinion from. And obviously we're grappling with social media, but also artificial intelligence and all these kinds of things. So how does someone navigate that very choppy set of waters? Or how do you best verify information and work out that it is the kind of information that you need?
That's not an easy task. The easy thing for all of us is to open our social media in the morning and read the news that are curated by the AI algorithm that knows how old I am and what gender I have and roughly what I've read yesterday to pretty much give me the same thing over and over again. So I need to make a conscious effort to go out there towards sources that are better than that. For example, what I always say to, including my students, including my son, is how do you know? How do you know that is really the case? So I tend to lean towards sources of media, for example, that invest in verifying the information they publish, that pay people to investigate or that pay people to figure out what really happened, Now that's not something everybody can do because many people have multiple jobs. Mm-hmm. They have real worries. They don't necessarily have time.
Not everyone is trained in this, literally,
and
to
not
a very high level,
yes.
like you are.
So, I think we have a lot to do about the way we educate children. These days, their impulse is to go towards some information they found on the web without even questioning where it came from and why it says particular things. And it's not helpful that they are completely surrounded by 3 30-second videos of this and that because it gives them the impression that you don't need to search. You don't need to put in any effort to figure out.
And so few people actually do long-form article reading anymore, do they? It's very clear the lack of engagement on these big pieces that are full of information. It's just very quick, short, sharp, like you say,
I don't know
videos.
I don't know data on that, whether people don't read the long forms in, Weekend Press, for example. But I do think that and this is not something new. Even a big chunk of social psychology research is dedicated to stereotypes. And a stereotype is a brilliant thing to help you organize the world around you. If you didn't have schemes or expectations, rough expectations of what somebody could be like or could look like, how do you navigate the world? That it's overwhelming. So to some extent, all of these things have always been like that. Nowadays, we have just more information to deal with. I just don't think it's impossible. So I collaborate with a colleague from the School of Law, and she investigates trust in user-generated evidence that is used in human rights violations in court of law. And what we noticed in a study is we gave participants a video of a drone attack. It wasn't it wasn't violent or anything, but we wanted to see how they figure out if it's true or not, if it's real or not, because we didn't tell them where it came from. We gave them no information. And quite spontaneously, many people started listing the things they would be doing. They would try to see if that video came up somewhere else. They would look at shadows. They would look at different elements. Is it vivid? Is the sound all right? Is the video too perfect? This is one of the things that was surprising. So people could be, to some extent, natural investigators if they are given the opportunity to do that. Now, how much we train children to be like that, and students, and how much we train ourselves every day, that's a different story.
As a pessimist, I'm not optimistic about all of this in the future. What about you?
About trust or
about trust, about what we read and where all the information comes from and how to work out what is true,
wasn't until 2 days ago, and then I saw a study that is currently under review by a young scientist called Victoria Colonia in Hamburg, and she led a team surveying almost 70,000 people around the whole world. And what they found was that people generally trusted scientists a lot. And another thing is that the majority wanted scientists to be more present in policymaking. So that gives me hope, actually, because over and above polarization and issues that are difficult to talk about, facts are still there. And I don't think, I think we underestimate people's thirst for knowledge that is not inflammatory, that is just the facts and helping them to lead a better life.
Well, I think on a relatively positive note, we're going to have to draw a line under it, but that was really fascinating, Gabriela. Thank you. If you want to find out more about Gabriela's research, you can visit her staff profile page on Swansea University's website, or you can visit her lab's website, which is www.trustlab, that's one word, trustlab.co.uk. To find out more about this podcast and Swansea University's research, visit swansea.ac.uk/research. That's all from us today. Thanks for listening, and thank you once again to my guest, Dr Gabriela Jiga-Boy. If you've enjoyed this episode, please follow us. I'm Sam Blaxland, and that was Exploring Global Problems from Swansea University.